Hello again, fellow mystery files. Today I continue on with my ranking of every Agatha Christie murderer and accomplice with the numbers 75 through 51. And just as a reminder, there are spoilers ahead, it's unavoidable here. And it's during this list where I think I finally start getting into some of the more notable murderers. Those of fairly good quality too. I'm almost all through the killers I think that are more on like the negative side than the positive side. So let's get started with number 75 with a villain from a Tommy and Tuppence novel, and that is Commander Haydock from N or M. And it's debatable to me if Commander Haydock is actually a murderer or not. I think we're supposed to believe he killed that British spy Farquhar at the beginning of the book, but we don't really have confirmation of that. And Haydock is a Nazi spy who infiltrates British life for espionage purposes. And I find his character to be one of the best villains in a thriller-ish sort of novel by Christie. He comes across as very ruthless, very James Bond villainy, with his spinning walls and his weird torture devices. I think his revelation as N is pretty decent. The mask comes off him well. I do enjoy seeing a murderer's transition once they're exposed, and I have to believe it, and I do believe it with Commander Haydock. He's this low, however, because I have some flaws with him. He's supposed to be the mastermind, and I can believe he is, but we don't really spend a lot of time with him, and to the point that M really takes over as the main villain of the book. And I feel as if I know a lot about Haydock otherwise, so he does fall short here at number 75. Number 74, and with this one, I think we're finally starting to move into a decently long stretch of murderers who I think are good characters and good murderers, but lack that something extra special that makes them stand out. I find a lot of these people just be the normal standard Christie killer, and the first of these comes in at number 74, and that is Lady Westholme from Appointment with Death. Lady Westholme is something of a victim on this list, at least because Christie largely focuses on the Boynton family dynamics at the expense of the other characters. I find Lady Westholme to be a decent character, but again, I feel like we just don't know a lot about her. And the revelation that she spent time in a prison really just comes out of nowhere. I buy it, but not fully so. And I do like the way she manipulates Miss Pierce into believing she heard things she didn't hear. There is some good work there, but I just wasn't wowed by Lady Westholme as I am with so many other Christie murderers, so she comes in here at number 74. Number 73, a similar sort, and that is Tim Kendall from A Caribbean Mystery. And again, I think there is a certain amount of ruthlessness with Tim. He murders at least four people in his life and possibly more. We just don't know how many wives he offed before the book started, and that is why I put him above Lady Westholme. But I think there is an argument for him to be below her simply because he makes a lot of mistakes. He's very sloppy. I mean, first off, he's in that picture of Major Palgraves, he leaves the pills behind, and he murders the wrong person at the end of the book. He doesn't seem to be a very competent killer despite having a number of kills under his belt, although he is bloodthirsty enough, and on top of that, I just feel like I don't know much about him otherwise, so I put him at number 73. At number 72, and this one might be a surprise to some, but I have William Blore from And Then There Were None. And I've always found Blore to be one of the less interesting characters in this book. I know this might be an unpopular opinion, but I find Blore to be a little more interesting than like the generic inspector characters we see in like Poirot novels. And assessing him purely as a murderer, I don't have that high opinion of him. His murder plan isn't really one, and he gave false testimony to incriminate an innocent man who later died in prison. And this isn't even brought up a lot over the course of the story. And it's heavily implied that Blore's corrupt nature isn't so much because he's like a nefarious person, but stems from him being a weak person who is easily manipulated and intimidated. So to me, he's not much more than like the likes of like a Gladys Martin, someone who was like tricked into committing this crime or whatever. I simply just don't find Blore fascinating, especially as a killer, but he is an important character in And Then There Were None, and that alone puts him this high at number 72. Number 71 is one of Blore's fellow guests, and then there were none, and that is the first boot off the island in survivor lingo, and that is Anthony Marston. And Marston is the first to die, and he goes fairly early on, but I always loved his characterization. Now, his murder is that of running over two children while driving drunk, so it's not a murder plot, nor is it even the kind of crime I like to see in a mystery novel, but Marston's characterization as a psychopath is fantastic. I always remember the little tidbit that his killing of those children, who he doesn't even remember their names, was inconvenient for him because he lost his license for 6 months. And that line alone tells me everything I need to know about Marston. I need no other information. I love how Wargrave kills him first because he's such a depraved human being that watching his fellow guests die one by one just simply won't have any effect on him. I did put him this low because he's not very important to the novel, nor is he an actual criminal mastermind in that he doesn't actually plot or want to kill anyone, so I placed him at number 71. At number 70, I have the killer from The Man in the Brown Suit, Sir Eustace Pedlar. I don't have much to say about him. To me, he's the typical sort of like thriller, James Bond type villain, quite a bit ruthless in the way he lures Anne into being his secretary and his constant attacks on people. When writing this, I did struggle to remember him clearly enough, which is probably a sign that maybe he is too high, but I do find him a competent villain and one who meets my criteria of being ruthless and evil, so I felt that was enough to place him at number 70. At number 69, a very similar character actually, and that is Alistair Blunt from 1-2 Buckle My Shoe. And like Sir Eustace, Blunt is heavily active in government affairs, and I actually think he might be the most ruthless killer thus far on the list I've talked about. His position with the government means his actions are even more despicable because he betrayed the public trust. His murder plots are quite vicious, murdering Morley the dentist just so he can freely murder his blackmailer. He and his wife also murder the real Maybelle Sainsbury Seal, and all of these people, by the way, are murdered quite brutally. I mean, they kill Mabel in like a horrendous fashion and just leave her to decompose in a trunk. The reason why I don't have Alistair Blunt higher is because I just simply don't find this character to be that interesting. It's not that I don't believe he is a murderer because I do, but I don't fully see that mask come off after the reveal, which I think was necessary for him, specifically given his status as such an important person in the British government. So I placed him at number 69. Number 68 is the murderer from The Mystery of the Blue Train, Major Richard Knighton. And somewhat similar to Blunt, I find Knighton to be a good murderer, but not too interesting of one. I like his plot. It's really brutal and purely for personal gain. He betrays the trust of his employer by murdering his daughter to steal her ruby. The fact that Knighton has a long history of theft and is also the Marquis is decent, although a little cartoonish in my opinion. I love his subplot of falling in love with Catherine Gray as it serves to humanize him in a way, but also simply makes him more of a scoundrel. But again, I don't find him very interesting, and when I think of Christie's murderers, Knighton never really comes to mind, so I have him at number 68. At number 67, we have another Tommy and Tuppence killer, and that is Sir James Beale Edgerton, aka Mr. Brown from The Secret Adversary. And this is a better version of Knighton to me. I mean, Sir James assists Tommy and Tuppence over the course of the novel, which makes him better than Knighton and like Alistair Blunt, is that when the mask comes off, Sir James is revealed to be Mr. Brown, and Christie fully commits to it. It's much more believable that this ally of the heroes was really the villain the whole time. Now, technically, he is a murderer. He does poison Mrs. Vandermeyer, but that is not really like the major plot point here. I think he does good deception work, although it doesn't really pan out after a while. His tricks work when he needs them to, but they don't really have like a lasting long-term effect. Is he the most riveting murderer too? No, not really, but he functions well and is truly the evil mastermind I wanted some of these other characters to be, which is enough to place him at number 67. Number 66 is one of the more iconic murderers, and that is Marina Gregg from The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side. And she's this high because of how important she is to the book and all of the good character work Christie puts into her. She is a somewhat ruthless killer, but she probably has one of like the worst plans in a Christie novel. She's caught poisoning her drink and then, spilling her original drink and then poisoning her new one by several people who then she has to kill, like the butler and Ella Zelinsky, and she can't take the pressure of it. She breaks down towards the end of the novel and may or may not have committed suicide as a result of this pressure. Personally, I don't think she did, but that's for another video. And Marina Gregg is pretty iconic, but I just don't consider her like an all-time great Christie killer. I don't think she had what it takes to like fully commit to her crimes here. And as great of a character as she is, I did have to place her at number 66. And number 65 is another guest from And Then There Were None, and that's General MacArthur, who may or may not be called General Mackenzie in your edition of the book. The general is a very strong character. I love how he regrets his decision to send his wife's lover to his death, not because he feels remorse over that, but because he simply didn't get what he wanted out of it. Leslie does stay married to him, but she becomes this lifeless shell of a woman who eventually dies young after much suffering. He's a very faithful member of the Church of England, but never attends services when they read the story of Uriah, which is a biblical tale of pretty much the same situation. I think Christie really puts in the effort to make him a vibrant character for what little time she gave him before he's killed off. But again, not truly an evil murderer. I don't think he would murder just anyone who stood in his way. For instance, I don't think he'd have killed the soldier who found out what he did. I don't really find him like particularly ruthless either, but selfish more like it. And because he isn't really a major character, I can't place him much higher than here at number 65. At number 64, from Cat Among the Pigeons, I have Anne Chaplin. And Anne Chaplin is a killer I remember being more interesting than I think she really is. She's a very cunning murderess who has no qualms about murdering whoever she needs to. Her first murder, when she kills Miss Springer, is not premeditated, so not much there, but that she does demonstrate her intelligence by murdering Mademoiselle Blanche with a sandbag to piggyback off of the murder she didn't commit. And she strikes up a brief fling with Adam the gardener, who isn't really a gardener, and then she tries to kill Miss Bulstrode. And I think all of these things demonstrate a competent, ruthless murderer. But for me, she simply isn't that interesting enough. It's not that she's like a total flop, like someone like Josiah Bland or like Iris Mullins or someone like that, but she doesn't really stand out too much with me, even within this novel. So I have her at number 64. At number 63, and this could be another unpopular selection having this one this low. And as a reminder, I would consider this part of the list to be where I think the good murderers start popping in, but here I placed everyone from Murder on the Orient Express, or more specifically, the passengers of the Calais coach. That includes the 12 people who served as the jurors, plus Countess Andreni as their accomplice. And I decided to keep all 13 of them together because they operated under one mind. It didn't feel proper to me to separate them like I did with other accomplices, and part of why they are so low is because of this. I think there are some construction issues with this group. First of all, their portrayal is very strange. I find it difficult to believe that such a wide variety of people, from a Russian princess to a lowly Italian butler to a military man, were all able to get together and plan this murder with what appears to be very little dissension and everyone on equal footing. It doesn't come off as realistic to me, and I also don't feel as if any of these people really stand out in the general scheme of Christie killers, with like Linda Arden probably being the most memorable. No, I think their plan is one of the best in Christie. It's very well thought out, very well executed, and they were able to adapt to the situation much better than other killers do when things go wrong. I think these characters vary in strength as well, as some of them kind of blend together a bit. Cyrus Hardman probably being the most forgettable, and he's one that like I often forget is even there. At least probably the least interesting of the bunch, as well as one. These people are iconic killers, but I think there's some issues they have coupled with the fact that they just simply aren't ruthless people, and that leaves them here at number 63. At number 62 is Christie's final female killer chronologically, and that is Barbara Franklin from Curtain. And this is sort of an odd one because Barbara Franklin's victim is herself, and she accidentally murders herself, but it's not really her fault. But anyway, I think Mrs. Franklin is a good, but not the best example of that murderer who appears friendly, but then the mask comes off and you see who they truly are. She attempts to murder her husband by poisoning his drink, but she accidentally drinks it herself, and I fault her somewhat for that. I mean, it's not really her fault, but it does expose that she just didn't have the best plan in mind. But I think she's a very selfish person, very ruthless. And we hear other characters talk about her like this, and she presents herself as this weak, sickly invalid. And when it's revealed that she's not that, it's a bit of a surprise. I think it works very well. And I think she's one of the more sinister killers, but there's an element of her being weak willed as well. I don't think she gets anywhere close to getting away with it had she actually been successful in killing her husband. I mean, you have to remember Poirot saw her steal the poison from the lab, but I don't think she, despite her characterization, has what it takes to pull off like a really good superior murder. So I have her at number 62. At number 61 is one of the guests from Cards on the Table, Anne Meredith. And Anne Meredith is very clearly a selfish and ruthless killer, but I have to say, not a very good one. I mean, it's clear to the police she murdered her previous employer, and she openly tries to kill Rhoda in front of Major Despard. I mean, not very intelligent, but a great murderer in how she's written. She possesses all of those traits I look for in the murderer, minus the intelligence. But she's this low for a few reasons other than her lack of good plans. One is that she's not the main killer in the book. She doesn't like act in a particularly sinister way, and she's a very rash person. And how she gets into the situation she's in is because of her rashness. I think she had she not died, she probably would have done something else to trip up the police in the murder she committed. Whereas I think the majority of the remaining culprits probably get away with their crimes had it not been for the presence of Poirot or Marple or whoever. So I have Anne Meredith here at number 61. At number 60 is a killer with a very bad plan, probably the worst plan, and who makes a lot of mistakes, but is this high because of her sheer evilness, and that is Nurse Hopkins from Sad Cypress. And this is the first of four murderers in a row who I don't think are very skilled at their crime. I've talked about this plot before when I ranked my Poirot novels, but there are just so many holes in Nurse Hopkins' plan to murder Mary Gerard, such as offering the poison to the person she's trying to frame. But even beyond that, she makes a number of blunders and she can't keep her mouth shut about Mary being Mrs. Wellman's daughter. And she does all this to alert Poirot to Mary's and actually inheriting all this money. And it's like there's no reason for her to do this until Eleanor has already been executed. And I'm also not sure poisoning yourself is the best idea. I think it's devious, but probably not like the smartest choice. And I contemplated putting Nurse Hopkins much lower, but I didn't because I find her really to just be pure evil. And she's very wicked, murdering multiple innocent people for their money. And keeping in mind, she murdered at least one other person in New Zealand, probably more. And she does possess those ruthless traits I love to see in a killer, but her plan was just so awful that I can't put her any higher than at number 60. At number 59, we have our only ancient murderer, Yamos, from Death Comes as the End. And I think I have a similar opinion of Yamos as I do like Nurse Hopkins, only his murder plans are noticeably better. Again, very wicked. He murders seven or eight people across this book, including most of his family and his wife. He's very deceptive, but at the same time, he doesn't really pull off the murders well. I mean, Satipi, the servant boy, Issa, and Hanette all know he is the murderer by the time they die, so he has to kill them. Although I guess the servant boy is probably a little questionable. He's another one who poisons himself, which is his downfall, or would have been actually because Issa noticed that he drank a lot of the wine but didn't die, but he kills her before she exposes him. And Amos is a bit of a sloppy murderer, but just as wicked as Nurse Hopkins, but I found him a little more competent in his execution of his plan, so I thought it fitting to put him one spot above her at number 59. At number 58, a killer who is both ruthless but not the mastermind, and that is Rowena Drake from Hallowe'en Party. And Rowena Drake possesses a greedy heart and wicked hands. She murders children to cover up her crimes. She and Michael Garfield murder Olga Semenoff and Leslie Ferrier to steal Mrs. Llewellyn Smythe's money. All very ruthless, cunning stuff. She may have even murdered her own husband. We don't know that, but she is manipulated by Michael Garfield, and she is under his control. And on top of that, Leopold catches her murdering Joyce, and she gets all wet in doing so. And clearly, she's not the most skilled here. And you also have to take into consideration that Miranda also saw her dump Olga's body in the well. And Mrs. Drake is clearly a terrible person, but does not have like some of the finesse I needed her to place her higher. So I left her here at number 58. At number 57, probably one of the least intelligent killers in a Christie work, but a fantastic character, and that is Gerda Christo from The Hollow. And like I said, Gerda's not too bright, and her plan to kill John is simply not good, and she only gets away with it for as long as she does because everyone else is helping her, and they're helping her because John told them to. I mean, this is not something Gerda does on her own. Now, she thinks she's smart, she thinks her plot is brilliant, but she's a fantastic character of this scorned housewife and a little bit more ruthless than I think she's given credit for. I do think she's a bloodthirsty killer of the woman scorned variety, and I appreciate her portrayal as not so smart of a murderer. It's very believable, and she's designed to be such. Some of the lower ranked Christie killers I have come across as idiots, more so from like a poor writing from Christie, either toward the end of her career or in her thriller books. But this is an intentional design for Gerda, and Christie pulls it off wonderfully. I can't put her too much higher because she just simply doesn't meet like the cool calculating nature of so many others, but she is a good murderer here at number 57. At number 56, another guest from And Then There Were None, and that is Miss Emily Brent. And I know there are a lot of people out there who don't think Miss Brent belongs in the same category as her fellow guests to Soldier Island, as she's the least culpable, and I strongly disagree with that sentiment. In many ways, besides Wargrave, I find Miss Brent to be the worst person on the island. She's this religious woman who is so into her ways that she thinks it's perfectly acceptable for her to throw Beatrice out when she's pregnant, out of wedlock, and feels absolutely no culpability for her suicide. Now, by the time of her murder, Miss Brent does start to feel the regret, but that's largely because she's been confronted with it. In her outside life, she never really cared much, apparently. There is a point where the other guests even believe she is UN Owen and think she axed Rogers, which I think is pretty indicative of her character. I don't think there's much difference between like Miss Brent and someone who physically killed another person in terms of like the moral character. Now, technically, she didn't physically kill anyone or lay out any kind of like murder plan, so she can't be too much higher than here at number 56. At number 55, and this is the point where it got very tricky for me to rank because I had to start splitting hairs around this point, which isn't even halfway through the list yet. But at number 55, I have Paul Renault, aka Georges Connu from Murder on the Links. And Renault is the victim in that book, but he's also a murderer, so let's not forget that. He did kill Monsieur Boraldi about 22 years prior, and I think there's a case for him to be quite a bit lower, given that he doesn't really possess that like sort of mean-spirited nature as he has apparently reformed since he committed his murder. But when we learn his plans to fake his own death, I think it's apparent he still possesses those wicked cleverness traits he once had. I also took into consideration the way he brought Poirot into the plot as tricking the detective is something that's a plus for me. But he's not the murderer in the book, at least not like the main murderer. Obviously, he didn't kill himself, and we don't have too much about his past known to us, but he does check all the boxes, so I think that was enough to place him at number 55. For number 54, someone who I think is wicked enough to be higher, and that is Dr. Eric Liedner from Murder in Mesopotamia, who is really Frederick Bosner. Dr. Liedner is rather a cruel individual, murdering his wife and murdering Miss Johnson in one of the most vicious ways in a Christie novel with hydrochloric acid. Absolutely brutal way to go there. Plus, there's all his like espionage activity prior to the novel. But for me, I think there's two issues here. One is that he's not entirely convincing to me that Dr. Leaner is like this truly evil person. I don't mean to say that I don't believe it because I do, but it's just not like fully there for me. There's something missing in him. And the other is that he's simply not as riveting of a character as those who I've ranked higher, but his very vicious and evil ways that propel him this high to number 54. 53 is someone who has similar issues, and that is Robin Upward from Mrs. McGinty's Dead. Again, I feel like Robin is truly a despicable human being. He strangles his adoptive mother, bludgeons Mrs. McGinty, and frames an innocent man for his crimes. But I don't 100% fully commit to believing it. There's this like unsavory portrayal of Robin as gay, and he's depicted in the typical stereotypical way you would expect for the time, and that makes him quote unquote soft, which doesn't make it a little difficult for me to like fully believe he committed these evil acts. But he is at number 53 because I do believe it somewhat. He is a satisfying murderer who checks all the boxes, but his odd portrayal prevents me from placing him a little higher on this list, so he lands here at number 53. Number 52, I really think this is the highest ranked character who is not that interesting, and that is Mr. Symington from The Moving Finger. And Symington is purposely bland, however, as he's supposed to be this like genteel country lawyer who is very proper and all that. This all shields a wickedness. He wants to murder his wife so he can marry Elsie Holland, so he plans this whole poison pen letter shenanigans, and it's really a cruel plot, worrying innocent people and causing them to be ostracized potentially and in general just causing them a lot of emotional harm. He murders the maid Agnes quite brutally and later tries to do the same with Megan. He will stop at nothing to achieve his goal. At least that's almost nothing. There isn't anyone he won't murder and anyone he won't harm except for Elsie Holland, that is. And I have to say, his unwillingness to harm Elsie in any way, including by not sending her a letter, really prevented me from placing him higher on this list because he does demonstrate that he's not like 100% willing to go there, as some of these other characters are who will hurt people they love. So he doesn't have a limit, so that placed him at number 52. At number 51, the final killer in this video is someone who I think fits perfectly in the middle of the list. He checks all of the boxes I look for, but doesn't reach the top tier in any single one of those categories, and that is Major Burnaby from the Sittaford Mystery. And Major Burnaby is an intelligent man. His murder plot is strong and creative. He's willing to take risks, deceive others, and possesses a certain amount of ruthlessness. However, he's not over the top in any one of those categories. He doesn't give me like the chills when I think of his plot. He does murder his best friend for money, and it's a small amount enough of money that I don't think most people would have killed for it, but it's also large enough to make it worth his while. And all around well rounded killer. But I will say, while I don't find him boring or bland, I do think he could have used a little bit more characterization. And I think his is not bland again, but like I think because there's so many characters in this book, he was just simply sidelined for a lot of the novel, and it does leave him a little underdeveloped for my liking, so I have him at number 51. Well, that's it for this video. Make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below. Next week, I continue my ranking of every Christie culprit with numbers 50 through 26, so stay tuned for that. Until next time, Mystery Files.